by Alice Mayers. Alice, welcome, and thank you
Thank you.
for coming and spending some time with me. Now, Alice, we've never actually met, have we?
No. These strange days.
I know. But we were introduced because there's such a common, not a commonality, but a really strong thread between what we both do around stories, that somebody that we both had, and again, actually, I've not met Sally in person either. and she has been on A Story Live with me as well, but she suggested that we connect, and of course we do have a huge amount in common in the work that we do, and I'm absolutely intrigued by what you do, and I keep telling people, did you know there's somebody that does this? Isn't it amazing? So yeah, without further ado, Alice, please tell us a little bit about what it is that you do, and then, you know, a bit about your background, how you came to be doing it.
Okay, so I run a little business called The Story Keepers, and my aim is to capture and preserve people's stories and memories. And I do this through, I do it through very informal interviews, either remote or face-to-face, depending. And from those, I create audio recordings, and I can do a sort of desert island disc style recording or a straight audio recording. I do films, and I create life story books. Yeah.
Lovely. I love all that. That's amazing. Yeah. So Alice, how did you come to be doing it? It's such a unique business.
So I have a background of the last a long time. I'm terrible with dates. I've worked in the museum sector, the heritage sector, for cultural organisations, where oral history is a really important part of the work that we do. Oral history and stories. So either stories from people in different times, but also I've worked a lot with young people telling their stories through different creative mediums. And that is a part of my work in museums and places like that I really, really enjoyed. Then, and it turns out I'm quite a slow learner. And so after quite a while, it turns out that I'm a really bad employee. It's just not for me. And there was a bit of a thread running through my career that I used to kind of be a little bit dissatisfied. Then I was very, very lucky that a friend of mine had decided to become a careers coach, and she asked for a guinea pig. I was a very happy guinea pig. She went through her process of helping people choose their careers, and through a conversation in a coffee shop with her, she suggested that the bits that I love, which is the oral history, and the gap that I saw in oral history museums is that people tell their stories to a museum or to an institution, and it's very specific about a project that institution has chosen to do, rather than the stories that the storyteller wants to share. So I realized it's the storyteller wants to tell their stories. The families should be able to capture and preserve those stories, and maybe that wasn't happening very much, except for in books, which is fantastic. But oral history can be more than that. It can use the voice, the hand movements, the sense of humor, the way you speak, everything. And so I thought, let's do it. I wasn't that satisfied in my last job, and I thought, I'm going to give this a go. And now I get to work with lots of different families and different storytellers, and I find it's a real huge, great honor, and it's a privilege, and I'm really enjoying doing what I do.
Fabulous. And you're so right. That's exactly, I feel, with what do I do with it, which is helping people craft their stories for speaking. I find it such a privilege to hear and be part of that, building the story and getting it out to a wider audience. But
Yeah.
so see how there's a need for what you do. I mean, both of my parents have gone now, but I remember when my mum, she would have been in her sort of late 80s, early 90s, and my children, she hadn't had that because they were born overseas, and they haven't seen so much of her as perhaps my nieces had done. They didn't get to hear so many of her stories. I mean, she built Spitfires during the war, which of course, you know, as I was growing up, didn't seem such a big deal because of other people's parents had been involved in the war effort, of course. But now for her grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, some of whom she never met, it would have been amazing to have some of those stories. She also was one of a family of 11, and there was all sorts of stories of, you know, things they'd get up to and all of that. And I bought her this book, and I think it was called Grandma Tells or something like that, and it was a blank notebook. I think there might have been some prompts, and I was hoping that in her hours of sitting in the winter watching the TV during the day, she'd actually feel inspired to write. But sadly, you know, she left this world never having put pen to paper in that book, and something like this would have been fabulous, absolutely fabulous.
Yeah,
but
I think
it's not only elderly people that come and tell their stories, is it?
it's not. And I think there's when you tell a story, there's two massive great benefits. For the person who's telling the story, as you say, if you give someone a notebook and say share your stories, sometimes for some people that just works, just they fly with it and do and love it. But some people sort of need an audience. They need someone to prompt them to say, yes, this is interesting, to look interested, to be interested, and to kind of eke out some of the details which maybe they think is boring. But when they talk to someone, they know this is really interesting, this is valid, this is important, this is what people want to hear. And so I think by providing someone to do that is, it just helps the storyteller when they maybe get stuck, or if they think their story is not interesting. Because some people, if you've built a Spitfire, most people would go, well, that's pretty cool. But some people haven't. But even so, their story is interesting for me because they lived in different times. So for example, like how women were brought up was really different from how our daughters are being brought up. They weren't some women were just not expected to work outside their home. And so how that has affected their lives and is now affecting their grandchildren's lives, I think is just, they need to know those, where their families are in history. So for the storyteller, it's validating, and they kind of get to remember more things which they had probably forgotten, and they get to realize of some of the challenges which they have maybe faced, which they have overcome, and and they will go back to places and people and that they have maybe forgotten, and remember maybe that they've lived quite a rich life, or the life that they've chosen to rich, however quiet or loud it might have been. And then, as you say, for the families to have that wealth of stories, to know also that their families have been through ups and been through downs and have survived, that their life wasn't maybe always a bed of roses, where they've come from, what their lives were like, and to keep those voices, which obviously are changing. Like if you think back to a voice from the 1950s, it's really different. And I always think it's really funny to think, so the voices we're recording now, in 30 years time, people will be thinking, they spoke like that, they use those phrases.
No, that's true. Yes, I thought you meant the actual technology of it, but no, the actual wording, of course.
Yeah, I think it's endlessly fascinating how that changes over time.
Yeah, and I completely resonate with what you're saying about helping people see that what they think is ordinary and potentially boring because they've lived it, and they, it probably, for my mum, making Spitfires was a job. Well,
yeah,
it was. So, she didn't necessarily see it as that interesting, but there weren't many people, by the time she got to 94, there weren't many people still alive that had made Spitfires. So it's that, but also that thing of somebody else reflecting and, oh, that's really exciting, because that's often what happens to me. Some of my clients come to me because they don't think they've got a story.
Yes.
So my life's been very ordinary and boring, and I'll always find something that,
yes,
that's different, or,
yes.
And
or even if it's just how you reacted from that thing, or and it might be because the place you're in, or and it's your circumstance, it's your story, and it's different for everyone, because no one else has lived that life or made those decisions and those choices that you have made.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I always say to people, we could all have witnessed the same event, gone on the same holiday or whatever it was, and we will recount it differently, and it will have meant different things to us according to what we've been doing and the family we grew up in until that point.
Yes, and it also will vary according to who you're telling the story to.
Yes, that's
so
true. Yes,
and so obviously, and there were some huge advantages of having someone tell the story to someone who's not part of the family, who is slightly removed, who they feel that maybe they can say these things to. And it's quite interesting, often storytellers will tell you something which they wouldn't tell their family, despite the fact they know that the family is going to listen to it. So they're happy for their family to hear this stuff, but they want it to go via, they don't want to say it directly.
Yeah.
So sometimes you get some different stories because you're not quite so, you're slightly more removed.
Yeah, and I can kind of understand that, I think, because they're not having to deal with the backlash or the upset or the fallout, are they? That might come later or not, but they're not having to deal with it at the time. I can kind of see that, I suppose.
Yeah, they're sort of putting a barrier or something up.
So who are the different categories that you work with? Obviously the older generation who are putting it down for history, for posterity, but it's not
it's not just that, but generally the people that I work what tends to happen, which I find quite interesting, is people whose parents are getting older will ask me to record their parent stories. So I do sometimes get people coming directly to me. In fact, I've got a few new clients who are doing exactly that. And sometimes it's people who kind of think that for one reason or other, they would like to capture their parents' story. Maybe because it's a big story, maybe because they know their parents are getting iller or older, and they think, let's do this, let's get this recorded now. Because it also has the advantage, if you know that your parents say maybe going to suffer or are going to need some care in the future, as well as having that, their parents are going to have those memories to look back on, because the parents are going to be able to see the film or the book or whatever and remember all those things they've done, remember who they are. I think it's quite important then for a carer to know, who is this person I'm caring for? This is the person that I'm caring for. It's not just a sick patient with an illness. This is the person behind that patient. This is the real person there. So I think there's those sort of things too. Sometimes it's quite, people like doing it to celebrate a moment, like a retirement, an anniversary, a big birthday coming up, because it's an opportunity for that person just to talk about themselves. And other people do it to get conversations going and moving. So I recorded a chat quite recently, and what they did is they wanted me to make a film that they were going to show at his 70th birthday party. It wasn't going to be a huge party, but kind of an intimacy party, and they wanted to show this film. And this family sat around and they watched this film, and it opened up conversations around their grandfather's life. So they didn't, like, the grandchildren never realized that their grandfather had suffered quite a serious mental illness, that he had suffered serious racism earlier in his life. And so it allowed the families to start having these conversations and talking about these things, rather than that thing when you go to a funeral, to being blunt now, you go to a funeral and you go, oh, I never knew so-and-so did this. Like, why do that? Why not have the conversations and find out more? And especially at the moment, sometimes it's quite difficult to keep those conversations going because no one's doing anything. Yes. So to start opening up a door of, right, here's a wealth of conversations you could have about something back in the day, have those conversations and get those started. So another lady, she did actually ask me to record her mum. Her mum was a long way from her, stuck in lockdown, far from her family, was shielding, was totally on her own. And so her daughter wanted me to start recording her, A, because it was a great opportunity during lockdown, and B, so that they could have those conversations, because if they were beginning to wind each other up.
Right. Yeah, good idea. Yeah. I don't know if you've come across Clubhouse yet, Alice.
Not really.
I was on there the other day and I forget what the topic of the room was, but somebody who was talking, she does some work with, I'm not quite sure what the parameters of the group, but a group, I got the feeling that quite a few of the group had perhaps had either given their children up for adoption or taken into care, and she was encouraging them to write a letter for those children, explain why they'd had to do that. And I'd said to her, would you be interested in an introduction to this amazing woman that does this thing? And it's not that easy to follow up on Clubhouse.
Yeah.
I was out walking my dog at the time or something, and she's not come to me. But I thought that although that would be hugely, hugely emotional for the mother to do, that would be a fabulous thing. And
yeah,
back in the day, when people almost, not forced, but there was a huge pressure on single mums to give up their children. That would have been a wonderful thing to have been able to do, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. To be able to know that your story is there for when someone is ready to receive it, I think is
yes.
And I think it would be quite a relief to know that your story is accessible at some point. Your version of events is you know, regardless of what happened, that you can say your piece, to say how it was for you at that time, is quite important. Yeah.
Oh, well, I think that would be a very cathartic and healing exercise for that person themselves, you know, regardless of whether the other person ever listened to it.
Yes. But, regardless if they listen, or regardless if it's the same story that they had, whatever. It's like, just to say your story, as you know, to know that you've got that ability to do that, I think is really important.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say it's quite a cathartic experience to share your story and to go back through it.
Yeah,
those memories. Yeah,
it is fabulous.
Yeah.
So I can see why you love what you do. Absolutely.
Oh, it's such an honor. I get a massive kick every time.
And things I know that we might get interested, because you're sharing a room with your children. This has been in lockdown, obviously.
Lockdown. So they're going to come back at some point to do their lessons.
So just to flag that up for our listeners, that you know,
thank you.
Happen. It's out of our control. But before we move on to that, I obviously it wouldn't be appropriate for you to share details of any of your clients' stories. But is there something in terms of circumstance that, you know, of that you would like to share with us today?
So there's one story that I thought I might share with you, which is I have this awful habit of, my last client's always my favorite because they're in my mind, and when you hear someone's story, you hear them explaining their version of events, it's very difficult not to slightly fall in love with them. So I was asked by two daughters to record their mother's story. The mum was in her late 80s, and it's a very, very close-knit little family, and they're very, very close to each other, and it's a very sweet, endearing relationship, actually. And their mum had begun to feel quite low, begun to think that she hadn't done much with her life, that hadn't, you know, it's all past and what had happened. So they asked me to record her story to see if we could remember some things and to remind her mum what an amazing life we did. So we did about 4 hours of recordings, and by the end, we were nowhere near the end. Well, there was lots of things we hadn't talked about. So the mum was like, oh yeah, I guess I have had have done quite a lot of things. So that was a really nice thing. But there was one moment I kind of thought, it's always sort of struck with me that we'd been talking for quite a while, and we were talking about her childhood, and her childhood had been, she, you know, was brought up during the war, and it had been quite traumatic. She'd had to move house, she'd had to move school, she was sent to boarding school, so it hadn't been very easy for her. And then she was living in a pub, actually, with her mum, and a terrible event happened. There was a tragedy. There was a horrible fire in this pub, and she remembers it very clearly. And she was quite traumatized by it. She was traumatized by what she saw and the event, and she was also very upset by the fact that her mother had been out and came home and didn't realize that her daughter had been saved and that her daughter was fine. But she remembers seeing her mother, and the anxiety on her mum's face was difficult for her to remember it. But it was an important story, and she wanted it to be recorded. And so we recorded this story, and then following the story, we had a moment or two sort of break. And then then she went on to tell us about an event she went to, a show she saw shortly after this fire. And she was an actress, the storyteller, and she imitated the lady that she had seen in singing. And there was something in the way she spoke and the release from this very traumatic event, which sent us into convulsions of laughter. And what I forgot to say, which was quite unusual in the circumstances, was that her daughter was present in the room, which could have been difficult. She might have interfered or changed the dynamics, but actually she was very respectful of her mother, just listening. And so we caught on, and when I'm recording, I try and stay as quiet as I can. I mean, I couldn't, like, honestly, the laughter, we were crying. It was complete, there was nothing we could do. But we caught the mother and the daughter laughing just wholeheartedly together. And I think it's one of the favorite things I've ever captured, because it was just so spontaneous. But I kind of think it represented the relationship between the mum and the daughter to, you know, quite a lot. And it was a really beautiful moment. And I think what I learned from that is to accept emotions, that emotions, you know, people will get upset, but that will happen if you're in a respectful environment and it's a safe environment and you give the storyteller time to talk. And that's okay, as long as you kind of can deal with that afterwards. And the way that situation dealt with it was that we cried with laughter. And I think it was the release. So I guess I learned to be respectful, to just listen to what is happening in the room, and to trust that space.
Lovely. That is a lovely
Yeah.
story. Thank you, Alice. And I always like to sort of give an idea, if I can. If I don't know whether you do ever do any speaking about your work or
Yes.
like that, but there's so many different angles that you could speak about. Obviously, there's telling people exactly what it is that you do, but that story illustrates the cathartic healing aspect of sharing story, and the deepening of connection that comes from hearing people's backstory. And something that you said earlier on really resonated with me, in that, you know, you end up falling in love with your last client. And that always reminds me, you know, usually in my experience, if we meet somebody that, let's just say, we don't resonate with them that naturally,
Happens.
you can go as far as to say they might actually irritate the hell out of you or whatever. But usually, in my own experience, when I've then heard something of their backstory, that's usually mitigated.
100%.
Yeah.
I totally and utterly agree, because you understand where they're coming from and why they maybe are like that. I completely agree.
And of course, for some people, and you know, maybe this will be, let's say, the grandchildren are sort of going through that adolescence where older people are almost annoying because they have to be considered. Actually hearing those stories and the backstory, and as you said, recognizing that they are people that did some really interesting things, have been through some tough times, all of that. So hugely valuable work that you're doing, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a joy.
Good. Yes, I can see. So no longer ever have to be employed again, Alice.
Oh, fingers crossed.
So where can people find you? Where can they connect with you?
Yeah, so I am on Facebook at The Story Keepers UK. Same on Instagram, and I have a website, www.thestorykeepers.co.uk. I'm always, I kind of think it's the sort of thing that you kind of need, you know, it's nice to have a connection. So I'm always very well open to kind of having conversations with people who are thinking about it. Some people are often worried about the cost. Other people are often worried that their parents won't be up for the idea. So I guess my prices start from just over £200. So you know, it takes me a lot of time to do this work, but I want it to be as affordable as I can possibly make it. And I just, you know, I think the other thing to know is that everyone has, as you said, stories to share. You know, regardless of whether you've lived a big life or a quiet life, however it is, you know, and through talking, we can always find those beautiful stories.
And the reality is that as a grandparent, you are going to have lived a very different life from your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, aren't you? So
exactly, yeah. Absolutely. So it's the context of your life as much. Yes, completely.
Yeah. Alice, thank you so much for joining me today. But absolute pleasure to speak, and I'm sure our paths will continue to cross.
I hope so, Rachel.
Yeah. All right. Take care, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.